We have been lied to by centuries of fairy tales, Victorian poetry, and Hollywood blockbusters. When you hear the word knight, your mind likely conjures an image of a literal saint in shimmering steel, a defender of the weak, a romantic poet, and a man bound by a sacred code of honor called chivalry. We imagine them rescuing damsels and fighting for justice. But if you were an ordinary person living in the 11th or 12th century, the sight of a knight on the horizon wouldn't bring hope. It would bring pure, unadulterated terror. The reality of the knightly class was not one of gallantry, but of sanctioned thuggery. To understand the dark side of chivalry, you have to realize that knights were, first and foremost, the heavy weaponry of a brutal feudal system. They were the tanks of the Middle Ages, and like tanks, they were designed for one thing: the efficient destruction of property and human life. The concept of chivalry didn't even begin as a moral code. It began as a technical manual for a professional warrior class. The word itself comes from the French chevalier, meaning nothing more than a man who could afford a horse and the expensive gear to fight from it. In the early days, these men were little more than high-born gangsters. They were the younger sons of nobles who had no land to inherit and nothing to do but fight. Without a common enemy, they spent their time terrorizing the local peasantry, extorting protection money, and burning down villages to settle petty disputes with rival lords. The situation became so violent that the church had to intervene with movements like the Peace and Truce of God, essentially pleading with knights not to kill priests, women, or farmers on certain days of the week. This was the birth of the chivalric code, not an outpouring of noble spirit, but a desperate attempt by society to restrain a class of hyper-violent men who were tearing Europe apart. When we talk about the dark side of chivalry, we have to talk about the primary way knights actually fought: the chevauchée. While Hollywood loves a grand battle like Agincourt, medieval warfare was actually a game of economic terrorism. A chevauchée was a scorched earth raid. A group of knights would ride through enemy territory, but they wouldn't look for the enemy's army. Instead, they targeted the defenseless. They burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and put entire villages to the torch. The goal was to starve the enemy's tax base into submission. Imagine being a peasant mother and seeing a line of chivalrous knights approaching. They wouldn't offer protection. They would steal your winter food supply, kill your husband if he protested, and burn your home to the ground before riding off to the next village. For the knight, this was a glorious day of service. For the ordinary person, it was the end of the world. And what about the treatment of women? The idea of the damsel in distress is largely a literary invention of later centuries. In the actual Middle Ages, the code of chivalry applied almost exclusively to women of the knight's own social class. A noble lady might be treated with performative respect, but a peasant woman was often viewed as little more than property or a perk of war. The chronicles of the era are filled with horrific accounts of sexual violence committed by knights during campaigns. Acts that were rarely punished because the victims weren't noble. Even the famous courtly love was often a thin veil for power dynamics. A knight serving a lady was often a political move to gain favor with her powerful husband or to secure a claim to her lands. Then there were the tournaments. We think of them as sporting events with colorful tents and blunt lances. In reality, early tournaments were chaotic, lethal mock battles that spilled across miles of countryside. Knights didn't just play for points, they played for ransom. If you unhorsed a rival, you didn't just win a trophy. You claimed his horse, his armor, and his person. You could then hold him for a massive sum of money that could bankrupt his family. It was a high-stakes gambling ring where the currency was blood. These events were so violent and focused on greed that the Pope repeatedly tried to ban them, calling them detestable, and denying a Christian burial to anyone who died in one. Yet, the knights kept fighting, driven by a thirst for gold and glory that outweighed any religious devotion. Even the equipment of the knight tells a story of darkness. The transition from chainmail to full-plate armor wasn't just about defense. It was about creating a class of untouchables. A fully armored knight was nearly invulnerable to the tools of a commoner. This created a massive psychological divide. To the knight, The common foot soldier or the peasant was an inferior species, someone who could be trampled under a horse's hooves without a second thought. This elitism fueled a culture of extreme arrogance. When knights were captured in battle, they were treated as guests and fed wine while they waited for their ransoms to be paid. Meanwhile, the common soldiers who had fought alongside them were often slaughtered on the spot because they weren't worth anything in the ransom market. The Crusades represent the ultimate expression of this dark side. Under the banner of the cross, the chivalric class exported their violence to the Levant. The accounts of the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 describe knights of Christ, wading through blood up to their knees, killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. Chivalry, in this context, became a tool for dehumanization. If the enemy wasn't a Christian, the code didn't apply. You could break your word, torture your prisoners, and sack cities with a clean conscience, believing your violence was sanctified. Ultimately, chivalry was a PR campaign that worked too well. It was a thin coat of gold paint over a rusted, iron reality. It was a system designed by the 1% for the 1%, meant to justify the existence of a violent warrior class that lived off the labor of the poor. The knight was not a superhero. He was a landlord with a sword, a man whose status was maintained by the threat of extreme physical force. When we look back at the Middle Ages, we shouldn't see the knight as a symbol of virtue, but as a reminder of what happens when a society grants a small group of people the exclusive right to use violence, and then dresses that violence up in the fine silk of honor. The dark side of chivalry isn't just a footnote in history. It is the true story of how power was held and used in a world where might didn't just make right. It made you a legend.